Welcome to Leading with Empathy and Allyship, where we have deep, real conversations about how we can be more inclusive leaders in our workplaces and communities. And I want to say you don't need to be an official leader in your company to lead. We all need to lead this work. So I'm Melinda Epler, the founder and CEO of Change Catalyst and the host of the show. At Change Catalyst, we build inclusive innovation through training, consulting, coaching, and events. And this is a safe space to learn here. We work to build empathy for each other, to understand tangible actions we can all take to build a better world for our colleagues, our friends, our neighbors, and ourselves. So in episode 53, a couple episodes ago, Renzo, Marva, and I discussed some of our research findings on allyship. And one of the findings included how people learn about the need for allyship. And the number one thing by far that came up was, I learned about a negative experience a friend or colleague went through. Number two was, I learned through my own negative experience with bullying, with harassment, with discrimination. Number three, I learned about somebody else's experience at an event. And then the others were, I learned about it through training. I learned about a negative experience a family member had. I learned on social media, a book, a news article. Most of that is storytelling. So I'm excited to talk about this today, the power of storytelling to create change, with Cynthia Overton, Senior Director of Tech Workplace Initiatives at the Kapor Center. And we'll be discussing ways that storytelling can affect change by advocating for ourselves and each other, building empathy, and really shaping the narrative around diversity, equity, and inclusion. So welcome, Cynthia. So good to have you here.
Thank you, Melinda. I'm so excited about our conversation, and I really appreciate you having me here today.
Yeah, I'm excited too. So before we jump in, let's just briefly describe ourselves to anybody who is blind or low vision or listening on the phone or listening to the podcast. Go ahead. You want to go first?
No, you go first.
Okay, so I'm a white woman. I have long red hair, black and white glasses. I'm wearing a green sleeveless shirt.
All right. And I am a Black woman. I have natural curly hair that I wear up. I have on a black shirt and a gold necklace. And then in my background, there's a beige screen and a plant and a wall mirror.
Awesome. And my white background is just a white background. Awesome. Cool. So today our ASL interpreters are Juan and Jennifer. And thank you to Interpreter Now for that ongoing partnership. Really appreciate them. This is also being live captioned by Maggie at White Coat Captioning. So if you want to turn on captioning, go down to the bottom of your Zoom screen and just click on, I think it says now live transcript, not closed captioning. It might be different on different screens. So our team, Renzo, Araya, Juliet, Christina, and Emily, are all kind of doing behind the scenes amazing work to make this all happen. And they're also in the Q&A. So if you have questions, we have technical issues, please ask. And then engage with us in the chat. It's really helpful to know what you're learning, what you're thinking, what questions are coming up for you. And also use the Q&A function if there's specific questions you want to make sure that we address. And I see you, Echo. Absolutely, of course. Good to see you. Hey, Lillian. All right, so let's jump in. So Cynthia, let's start with your story. Can you tell us a bit about how you came to be here now, doing the work that you do? Where did you grow up? How did you decide? Why did you decide to do this work of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and dedicate your career to doing it?
Yeah, sure. I'd be happy to. So first of all, I work at a wonderful racial justice organization called the Kapor Center, which is dedicated to leveling the playing field in the tech industry. We're based in Oakland, California. I am not from California, though. I was actually born in Detroit. And by the time I was about 5, we moved to a suburb for the public school systems. When I entered public school at age 5, I tested higher than any other kindergartner in my class, actually in the school. And by the time I graduated from high school, I barely graduated from high school. I mean, I actually was put in an all-girls Catholic school, and the nuns had to do an intervention to actually convince my Spanish teacher to allow me to graduate from high school. So that's a whole story in and of itself in terms of how does one start school testing higher than anybody in the class to barely graduating. I was very, very, very fortunate because Hampton University had a summer bridge program. And the program essentially was for students like myself, students who had a hard time in school, but if they could prove themselves, they could enter the university. And so I was accepted to Hampton conditionally that I complete the summer bridge program successfully. And I did, and they allowed me to stay. And that was a real game changer in my life. As you may know, Hampton University is a historically HBCU, historically Black college university. And it was just a game changer for me. I mean, everybody there was treated the same. I guess most of us, we're Black or African American. And it just did so much in terms of my self-esteem and, believing in myself. And I ended up graduating from Hampton magna cum laude. So was very successful in undergrad. After I finished college, I took a job at an insurance company. And then after that, I started teaching. And then when I was about 26, I started experiencing some weird things, health-wise, and I don't need to go into the details in terms of the symptoms, but the punchline is doctors discovered a blood vessel that had been growing inside of my spine since I was born, and it had finally hemorrhaged. And after it hemorrhaged, it had to come out. So I had spinal cord surgery. And after the surgery, I was completely paralyzed from the waist down. I couldn't stand, I couldn't walk, I couldn't feel my legs. And it was tough in terms of, I was 26 at the time. That was, it was the time of my life. I mean, I had a lot of fun in my 20s, I'll just say that. And so it was a very humbling experience in terms of, having your life just change essentially overnight. Yeah. And so I lost everything. I lost my job. I lost my apartment. I was so lucky though, in terms of I had a very, very loving family. So I moved back with my parents and I went to, of course, a lot of physical therapy. I, got to the point where over the course of a year, maybe 18 months, graduated from a wheelchair to a cane, and I continue to use the cane today. And I needed to really think about what I was going to do with my life. So I was visiting my brother. He's an attorney. He's awesome, just very nice, kind-spirited, and supportive. Visiting him in DC, and we were having breakfast, and he plops down a U.S. News and World Report in front of me. And it's that edition that has the rankings of all the schools, the graduate schools. And he plops it up in front of me and says, pick out a school to go to. He said, but I need the magazine back. And so I'm such a follower that I literally went through and said, oh, well, University of Michigan seems like a good school. Maybe I'll go there. And I applied and got in and ended up doing a Master's of Science and a Ph.D. in educational technology. And my focus was on technology and people with disabilities, particularly people who are blind and low vision, and how they use technology to engage with their learning environments. And that was really my starting point into disability. And to tell you the truth, I didn't know anything about disability until I became a person who lived with a disability. And I see a note from Michael. Oh, sweet. Yeah, Michael has a son who's deafblind. So I didn't know anything about disability until I experienced it myself. I mean, Melinda, it was a thing of literally when I was in the hospital before being discharged, they said something about me having a disability and it didn't even resonate. until they told me I was eligible for a parking pass. Then I was able to accept it. So,
Wow.
so anyway, ended up going studying educational technology, focusing on people with disabilities. After graduate school, of course, I needed to get a job. Didn't really want to stay and teach in the academy, and ended up working for a behavioral and social science research firm.
Mhm.
Now, while I was there, I noticed that a lot of people were not reading the boring reports that I wrote. So I ended up going back to school to get a master's in public relations and corporate communications to really understand, like, how do you make research interesting to people so that they'll actually want to access it and use it. And since then, that point, I started doing a lot of work when it comes to knowledge translation. But while I was at that behavior and social science research firm, the need for diversity, equity, and inclusion became very clear. And I, along with other colleagues, really took a grassroots approach to pushing the organization on diversity. And even really back then, it was diversity and inclusion. We weren't
Right.
even really talking about equity
Right.
and belonging and all of that. And, we started off with brown bags where we would go and have these sessions, roundtables with different people within the organization to really understand what was going on. How were people feeling? How were people being treated? How were people feeling valued? And we put all those findings into a report and gave the report to the president at the time. His name was Saul Palavin. And Saul read the report and essentially said, okay, enough with the grassroots. We're going to institute a formal diversity, equity, and inclusion program or initiative, I should say, at the organization. And Saul participated in those meetings early on. He was part of writing the mission statement. He was incredibly hands-on and passionate about this topic, which I continue to appreciate to this day. Eventually they hired a director of diversity and inclusion, and under her leadership, she introduced employee resource groups to the organization. So I was able to launch the Black ERG and lead that. And then after doing that for a little bit, I transitioned over to lead the ERG for employees with disabilities. Now, throughout that time, I became more and more intrigued by the lack of diversity and inclusion in the tech industry. And ended up, going back and forth to California to be able to participate in different events and conferences. And Melinda, this, I'm so grateful to both you and Wayne for, engaging me, meeting with me, and inviting me to participate in your conferences as panelists. So very much appreciate that. And eventually I was able to land a position at the Kapor Center to lead a group called Diversity Advocates, which is a group of folks who are working in the tech industry to advance diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I would encourage anybody who might be interested to check us out at diversityadvocates.com. And that's pretty much my story.
Awesome. Well, thank you.
Oh, and I see Michelle. Michelle is an early diversity advocates leader. So yes, so yay, Michelle, yay, diversity advocates.
Definitely. Yeah. It has been a long road. The diversity advocates group went from just a tiny little side group to this big.
We have more than 1,000 members now.
Yeah. That's awesome. So thank you for sharing that. I didn't know all the details, so I appreciate that. When I asked you what you wanted to talk about in this episode, you said storytelling. Why?
I just think that stories really have the power to persuade and change. I think that it's very easy for people to be presented with very important statistics. But in the absence of context and in the absence of a story, they're easy to forget.
Mhm.
And when you tell stories, stories bring situations, problems, challenges, victories, all of that to life. And so that's why I really love stories.
Yeah, awesome. And for and I think many of the people who are listening know as well, that my background is, my first 10 years in my career was focused on documentary filmmaking, was using the power of storytelling to create change, to move people to take action and really motivate that culture change and systemic change through individual action. So super excited to talk about this. And I believe strongly that change happens through that combination of behavioral science, organizational science, and storytelling. It's all three of those things put together. And I think it's really important what you said a few minutes ago, that data can be very powerful, that research can be so powerful, but it really, you have to use it and create a story around that data, and have people connect with that data, that research, in order to have it really be infused with the power that can create change.
Mhm.
So important. I learned that lesson early on. So how would you say that storytelling can be used to drive diversity, equity, and inclusion?
Yeah, I think that one of the most recent examples that I've seen from this was a special on 60 Minutes. And they interviewed the Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin. And he talked about being in the military and how difficult it was as a person of color, as a Black man in the military. He says even now, there's not a day that goes by that he doesn't think about the fact that he's a Black man. I mean, literally, he thinks about that every single day. He talked about his experience being in the military, where when he was a 4-star general, if he were not in military uniform, if he were in civilian clothes, if he were to go out with a group of people and somebody was looking for the general, he was not the person that they turned to. Folks would turn to his colleagues, thinking that they were in charge, not him. And, for me, just hearing that one piece of the story, I thought did a really good job just in terms of explaining how people experience things. Then there was another general, his name is C.Q. Brown. He was interviewed on this special. And this gentleman actually, after George Floyd was murdered, released a video talking about racism in America and what Black folks have to go through. And with him, he was just done. He knew that, people might not necessarily respond well, but he just couldn't stay silent any longer. That video was viewed more than 4 million times. And now keep in mind, these are Black men talking about the challenges that are happening in the military. Even though the military was integrated more than 70 years ago, there's still these challenges there. There was this another guy named General Brad Webb, and he talked about how he just really didn't know that people experienced so many challenges and hardships when it comes to race, particularly in the military. And I mean, as a follow-up after George Floyd was murdered, they actually did a survey to understand the experiences of folks. And folks said they just had no idea the situations that people had to go through. Now, as a result, General Webb now hosts on Facebook Live something called Real Talk, where people have conversations about race and racism and inequities in order to bring these topics to the forefront. And, this is a very difficult situation or issue to discuss, of course, especially if you are on the receiving end of unfair treatment.
Mhm.
I think, though, that stories are really necessary, though, in order to highlight a problem so that a problem can be addressed.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's like we people who've experienced exclusion, who've experienced oppression, who've experienced discrimination are now like we also have to tell our stories in order to create change, which is unfair. And as we've seen in our data, it's the way that change happens. It's the way people learn.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
So.
and the whole point about, I never knew. I think that there are some people who would look to that and say, come on, you had to have known. Or storytelling won't change anything because everybody knows how bad it is. Well, some people might know how bad it is and choose not to do something. But I do think that it is important to create space for stories to help folks who really, don't have any idea. And I mean, can all problems be solved? Can racism be solved by storytelling? I'm not sure that there's any evidence to that. But one of my favorite sayings is, you what is it? I can't do everything, but I can do some things. Don't let what you can't do get in the way of what you can do. And if you can tell a story, I think it's important to try to tell a story.
I think that change happens with a lot of stories being told all over the world, all over in all kinds of different ways. I actually do think that is true. I posted the other day that change happens one person at a time, one act at a time, one word at a time. And then somebody responded and said that we need to go beyond individual change to systemic change. But if you try to change a system and forget the individual, you aren't going to change it very much. A system is made of lots of individuals, and individuals create systems, and individuals make up systems, individuals perpetuate systems. And so we change systems one act at a time. We change systems one person at a time and one story at a time, one word at a time, one story at a time, and really build empathy and build understanding. And also, I would say that when we're working on organizational change, it is a combination of changing processes and the stories that we tell along the way that really move people to take action and implement those processes. It really is a combination. Yeah. So one of the things that I around storytelling that I think is really important is that piece around building empathy and really building understanding. There's so many people that grow up, especially white people, that grow up with mostly people like them surrounding them, friends, family, colleagues that are very much like them and don't have those experiences and understanding of what other people go through. And I think building empathy and I think also building trust. You mentioned to me in a previous conversation. Why are those so important to this work? Why is that trust? Yeah.
I mean, when I think about empathy, stories bring experiences to life. I mean, even myself, I told you, I was literally paralyzed, didn't really think of myself as, being a person with a disability. And it was because of that experience that I was able to build empathy for people with disabilities. I had my own story to draw on. Before that, I was not listening to the stories of other people. And that's something that I really, really regret now, of course. But the process has made me more sensitive to the stories of others, other people, particularly other people who are not like me. When I was in a previous role years ago, I remember going and having a conversation with a staffer, a congressional staffer, and her member or the congressperson that she worked for, his whole platform centered around traumatic brain injury. And I was like, wow, does he have a family member who had a TBI? Is that why he isn't, interested in this topic? And she said, no, a constituent told a story about
Mm.
TBI. And it was that story that made him become one of the leading advocates for the rights of people with TBI in Congress. And so
Mm.
that for me, when she told me that it was a constituent, one person's story that
Mhm.
made him a champion, that I thought was really incredible. In terms of the trust piece, I think that people want to know that, and when it comes to trust and particularly diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, I
Mm.
think that people want to know that they're not the only one who has shortcomings or that fails. And I think that by
Mm.
sharing your own failures and being vulnerable with other folks can really encourage people to be able to look within themselves to think about what they might be able to do differently, understanding that they're not the only ones. But that, that involves a lot of trust.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we also found in our research that one of the things that keeps people from being allies and taking action as an ally is the lack of trust. And I think part of it is a fear of making mistakes, but part of it is a fear of, or part of it is a lack of that feeling safe in your work environment to take a leap for somebody else
Mhm.
and to put yourself out there for somebody else. Let's talk about being advocates and how storytelling, how do we advocate for people through storytelling?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's so important. I mean, you know, first of all, I think that there's something to admitting shortcomings.
Mm.
And when, as I was saying before, when you can admit shortcomings to somebody else who is in a position of power to make
Mhm.
changes, I think that that can kind of give them the permission that they need to really reevaluate their own behaviors and internalize the changes that they need to make. So I think that advocating for others can involve almost like holding a mirror to people to
Hmm.
encourage them to think about how they need to be doing things differently. Um, and I think that people are just more receptive to stories. Stories just land better, I think,
Yeah,
when you're trying to advocate on behalf of other people.
yeah, yeah. I'm in the middle of reading Barack Obama's very long book. um, but one of the things he talks about is, the stories that he heard, the individual stories that he heard along the campaign trail, and then also that his team picked a handful of letters that they received, and each night before he went to bed, he read those letters, those individual stories of people and the experiences that they are having, and that affected him personally and also affected policy changes, affected like big things. Michelle Obama
Mhm.
also, she picked a couple of things that were really near and dear to her heart to really focus on when she came to the White House. And one of those was to focus on veterans issues because she heard stories along the campaign trail. It
Mhm.
really is, they can be very powerful.
Yeah. Yeah. And when I think about, learning from folks who are different from myself, I mentioned before, I did not go into academia after I finished my program at Michigan. I went in a different direction. But I have a very close friend who is a tenured professor at a university. And they were telling me about it. Melinda, have you seen that special on Netflix, The Chair?
Yes, yes,
Okay,
yes, I have.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
And they were saying, if you want to know what it would have been like for you to go into the
yeah.
academy,
Mm.
any program, it doesn't matter what it is, watch The Chair. That would have been your experience. And
Mm.
so I watched it this one, and I was really blown away by how And I think that there are only maybe 5 or 6 episodes, but it just did such a good job of telling the stories of what happens in higher education, particularly through the perspective or the lens of people of color. And I was just like, wow, this is really something. Melinda, don't you think it would be super cool if Netflix did something like that for the tech industry?
Mhm.
Terms of a special from the
Yeah.
perspective of people of color and women and people in the LGBTQ community, people who live with disabilities. Netflix, if you're listening, Melinda and I will provide you with a list
Mhm.
of consultants for that project. In fact,
Mhm.
we'll be
Mhm.
consultants.
Well, could be consultants for that project. Absolutely. I'd be happy to. Yeah. Oh, I love it. Yes. I want to switch gears a little bit also to talk about the stories that we tell ourselves, because I think that's also a really important piece of this, of storytelling, and as it relates to diversity, equity, and inclusion. There's a few different stories that we tell ourselves. And the first one, I'll go maybe take one at a time. So the first one is the stories that we tell that might perpetuate biases and stereotypes and avoidance. With the stories that we tell, I don't know how to talk to that person with a disability, so I'm just not going to talk to them.
Mhm.
Or exclusion, perpetuating exclusion through the stories that we tell ourselves. What do you think about that? How do we, what are some of those stories, and how do we interrupt them?
I mean, I think that it is very easy for a person not to bother because it's more convenient. I mean, it's just more convenient to, take the easy way. But if that's a choice that you decide to make, I think that it's really important to understand that you're part of the problem and you're helping to uphold unfair treatment. So
Mm.
that's a decision that folks have to make. I will say, though, that it's very challenging when we think about the bigger story, like what we have all been told in terms of people of color are inferior, women are inferior,
Yeah.
people who are LGBTQ, it's okay to tease them or, belittle or berate. People with disabilities don't have value. These are the these are the stories that society has told everybody. And
Mhm.
so, one of the things that I really struggle with is how do you really interrupt that narrative so that we can tell the true story and so that people can really understand, um, the greatness behind us all. And
Mm.
so I do think that that's, something that's really important to be able to grapple with in terms of how do you change that narrative about different people.
Yeah, I've been thinking about this a lot lately. There, a couple of things come to mind. One is that I think we need to be careful about telling rags to riches stories, and Stella Young has a great TED talk called "I'm Not Your Inspiration, Thank You Very Much." She's
Mhm.
a woman with a disability that I think she actually says she's a disabled woman who talks about inspiration porn, that people with disabilities are often used as inspiration. Oh, you've overcome this to
Mhm.
be who you are now. And rather than, everybody is human and has unique experiences, and yeah, so I think that is one key piece, is the way that we tell stories so often is a story about someone with the framing of their oppression, the framing
Mhm.
of their oppressors, right? Or rather than, telling a story about that human as the achievements that they have made, and
Mhm.
starting there. So I do think, and I've been thinking about this the last few days in particular, that is a really key piece of storytelling. We need to change that narrative.
Mhm. No, I agree 110%. I agree 110%.
Yeah. And I think, maybe part of this too is that we need to be aware of the stories that we consume. and who tells the stories that we consume. What shows are we watching on Netflix? Are we watching The Chair? Or are we watching something that's perpetuating the same narratives and continuing those stories that are in our own heads? And yeah. One more thought. I have all these thoughts that are coming into my head right now. When we think about even just meeting somebody for the first time, we have a first impression. And that first impression is our stories that we are telling about somebody else in our own heads. And I think there's also a need sometimes to interrupt those first impressions that we have of people and allow those people to tell their own story to us.
No, I think that you're right. And I mean, I think that's something that I struggle with. I think about DEI all the time. And to your point, I really have to stop myself and allow people to tell me who they are, as opposed to making assumptions about, different people. And some of that really just involves being quiet and just listening.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And sometimes asking too,
Yeah.
Asking and giving people the space to say, yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay, so I said 3. The second one, so the first one is the stories that we tell ourselves that kind of perpetuate these biases and stereotypes and avoidance, exclusion. The second is the stories that we tell ourselves that perpetuate that fear response, and keep us from taking risks, from making mistakes and doing this work.
Well, I mean, I think that you have to understand that you're going to fail. And I think that once you can wrap your head around failure and not allowing failure to define how good of a person that you are or what you can do in the future, I think that if you can get past that, I think that you will be much better positioned to be able to be a good ally to people, to be supportive, to be a sponsor, mentor. But if you just, stay silent, you're not sharing your gifts and your value with other people.
I love that. Yeah.
And I was on a panel a while back, and somebody talked about the importance, and this is something that I really, really, really try to practice. And that is the importance of, first of all, being graceful. And second of all, pulling people in as opposed to calling people out. And I think that feedback is really, really important for folks, but I think that it's important to give feedback in a way that's productive, that will, at the end of the day, change behavior. So I kind of look at it as almost like battles in war. If I just need to get something off of my chest and tell somebody how I feel, and then, I've won the battle. And I have done a disservice to the war in terms of long term. That's not helpful.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah. Okay. The third piece of this, I think, in terms of the stories that we tell ourselves, is the remnants of internalized marginalization and oppression. The stories that we tell ourselves because other people have told us those stories about ourselves for so long throughout our lives. You talked about your when you went to college and your self-esteem grew, you started believing in yourself. I think that is kind of reshaping those stories for ourselves is so important.
Yeah, no, it really is. And it's so hard not to have feelings of self-doubt when you have been treated certain ways or, told certain things. And I think that those feelings are common, but any feelings of imposter syndrome, or, just feelings of I'm not good enough. They're just lies that are put in
Mm.
place to prevent certain people from succeeding and other people to hold on to the power. And so it really comes down to, are you going to believe that lie? And so I've started telling myself, I got to stop being so gullible. I'm not that gullible. I don't believe those things.
Mm.
And so I would really encourage folks to really fine tune your mute button when it comes to people who are not very productive in your life and are sending you messages, and just tune them out, because you're the bomb.
Fine tune your mute button, y'all. I love that. Yes. Yeah. Wow. Mm. Yeah. Thank you, Michelle, for transcribing that. I love it. Mm. Yeah. That that did it for me. I love it. We are going to jump to Q&A. I see one question in the Q&A. If you all have questions for us, please put them in the Q&A. Yeah, I am constantly still struggling with imposter syndrome, struggling with my confidence. I mean, that is the number one thing that we, again, going back to our research, that we heard from women in particular, the number one thing that they want from allies is to help give them more confidence, encourage. And I think that a key piece of that is that that has been taken from us, and for our life, throughout our lives. Jeremy Sussman spoke last season, or 2 seasons ago in the spring. We had a conversation about him thinking about allyship as a white man, as a white cisgendered heterosexual man. And one of the things that he said was that, yeah, he grew up being told that those stories that he can do anything, and that he just, and that, what a big contrast for many of us, right? That it's such a contrast. So fine tune your mute button.
Yeah.
All right, so a lot of people right now are. Oh, go ahead.
Can I just ask one question? And Melinda, my book hasn't come yet. So I'm going to ask if you can share, like, thinking about your book and the process of writing the book, as you're thinking about, allyship and empathy. Did, storytelling kind of play into this book at all when you were writing it?
Yeah. And by the way, that is the releasing a book during the pandemic is an interesting road, where the book is released last week for some people and tomorrow for others, and so it is just the supply chain issues around the pandemic. So it will be out soon for everybody. I realized in writing the book that it couldn't be just facts and figures and checklists. There are facts and figures and checklists in it, but that it also needed to have stories. It had needed to have my own stories and I talk about my own kind of path to allyship, my own journey to allyship throughout the book, my own kind of aha moments and realizations along the way, because I do think that is a really powerful piece of all of this, that everybody needs to know that nobody was born a great ally for everyone, that we all learn, we all have to learn. And that is a big piece of this. And it's definitely working together and learning and sharing with each other, sharing our own stories of learning and growth is really important. So there is that. And also I included stories of other people all along the way, people with diverse identities all along the way that I can't possibly represent as a white woman. And so that I wanted to be sure that those stories were in there, and that what people really wanted from allies was in there as well. Yeah.
Well, I can't wait to get my copy.
Thank you. If anybody wants to learn more about the book, go to melindabriannaepler.com too. So I have one more question, and there is a question in the chat too that we'll get to. We are now going on, I don't know how many months of the pandemic, and many more months to come, where a lot of us are working remotely, and or there's some hybrid companies now as well. And the need to build empathy is as important, if not more important now than ever. And yet it's, for some people, for some organizations, it's harder. They see it, because you actually have to schedule time to make connections, and rather than just kind of see people in the hallways, right? And so let's talk a little bit about how we can do this remotely, how we can continue to create the space for people, the safe spaces for people to tell their stories, and for people to receive those stories, and build the empathy and trust in the remote workplace.
Yeah. One of the things that the Kapor Center did, this was before the pandemic, they had stories of distance traveled, which allowed folks to understand how employees at the Kapor Center, their story and how they got to be at the Kapor Center. And I think that that's just such. Our colleague, Candace Chambers, led that initiative. And I thought that that was just so nice, because it, produced a video to really help people understand the stories and the experiences that people have faced in life. And so I think that really targeted initiatives, or I should say intentional initiatives, can really go a long way to helping folks, tell their stories. And even as we have, transitioned into this remote workspace, and we're going to transition now back, probably hybrid, just hearing stories. I live by myself. I'm single, not married, and I have no children. So if it weren't for stories, I wouldn't understand what it's like to have to juggle schedules and, look after little ones who are in the background. And so I think that for me, just hearing people's stories has gone a long way to help me be more appropriate when it comes to engaging with colleagues in the workplace. So I think that stories really are going to be essential as we transition, or as we think about what work is going to look like long term.
Yeah, and maybe part of that too is advocating for ourselves and telling our own stories about what we need. So that people understand what we need as we go back, or it's not going back, it's moving forward into a new reality, right? Of what that hybrid, remote, hybrid, whatever workplace looks like. And I think we have the opportunity, if we tell our stories and we really advocate for ourselves and each other, to design it differently.
Yeah, absolutely. 100%.
Yeah, one of the things that we do at Change Catalyst is every week, actually, we check in with each other about what's going on outside of work, whatever that is. And in the rules are, you can talk about anything that's happening, but it can't be about work. And occasionally, it enters into play because our work is a part of our lives. But for the most part, we do, and it makes such a difference in terms of understanding what everybody is uniquely experiencing, and so important. And you have to schedule it. You have to set aside time for it. What are those water cool moments that you can design?
Yeah, no, I agree.
Yeah. So we do have a question from Gina around examples of feedback.
Hey, Gina. I love Gina. So, I saw Gina's question in the chat, and it really made me think about a colleague that I have who is so nice and kind-spirited and patient with me. So my colleague uses they, them pronouns. And initially, when they started at the Kapor Center, and I would imagine there have been times where I have made mistakes that I don't even realize more recently. But whenever I use the wrong pronoun, they're always so kind and say, and I usually catch myself, and they've said, that's okay, and then just keep moving on. Even in a performance review once, I used a wrong pronoun, and the way that they gave me feedback was immediate, explicit, and kind-spirited. And I think that that's just so, for me, I just appreciate it so much. They also invited me to, just review and give feedback on a essay on pronouns. And for me, that was really helpful in terms of thinking about, identifying some of the things that I should that I should be doing differently. And for me, it was self-reflective exercise, I'll say. But for me, I consider myself very lucky that the feedback that I receive is so productive, because this is an individual who is so important to my work. Like, I know they're going to leave me eventually. And I want to, be in touch with reality to go on and do something else, because that's what folks do. They move on. But they are so crucial and critical to my work that I'm just so appreciative that they will give me the opportunity to do better. And so I would say that they just give great productive feedback.
I love that. I love that. I'm seeing there is another question from Michael. Could you comment on the intersection between authenticity and storytelling? So telling a story to sell that is not authentic versus telling an authentic story.
Yeah, and I think that, and thank you for that question, Michael. I think that that is very unfortunate. I mean, there are going to be some people who are going to operate in a way that is self-serving, and that's kind of how I describe that, as self-serving, when you're talking about using stories that are not authentic. So, I really am not sure what else to say about that, except for I've definitely seen that happen. It's pretty irritating,
Yeah, I think, maybe one suggestion I would have is to start with yourself and understand where you're coming from and what your motivation is, and make sure that motivation is, is serving the greater good, not just yourself. And start from a place of kindness and working toward change for the benefit of other people. Yeah. Well, fantastic. We could talk so long about this, and I love this. Obviously, I love this conversation. Thank you, Cynthia, for taking us down this road of storytelling.
Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed the conversation, and I really appreciate everybody who was able to join today. I really appreciate you giving us an hour of your time, and I hope that you enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah. Okay, everybody, what will you do differently? What action will you take? What stories will you tell? What stories will you consume differently after hearing what we talked about today? And we will see you next week, where I'll be talking with my husband, my partner, and my greatest ally, Wayne Sutton. We're going to be talking about the importance of improving mental health for Black men, improving mental health of Black and brown men, his trip across the country to raise awareness for the work that he's doing. And we'll also probably discuss a little bit about our own interracial relationship, and how we really think about allyship for each other as well. And my book, How to Be an Ally, is now officially available at your favorite bookstore. So please go buy it, go review it. Really appreciate reviews, and thank you for all of your support. You can learn more at melindabriannaepler.com. All right, see you all next week. Thank you. Have a good week.
Thank you.
Bye.